The station smelled like recycled air and old ambition. Nina Caldwell had learned to stop noticing it after the first 2 years. Now, in her 11th year as Earth's senior ambassador to the Galactic Concord, she noticed almost nothing about Carithvel that she had not already catalogued, categorized, and filed away somewhere in the back of her mind. The curved corridors of pale gray composite. The soft hum of the environmental systems that kept 17 different atmospheric blends pumping through 17 different residential sectors. The particular sound that the main chamber doors made when they sealed before a formal session. A low, pressurized thud, like the lid of something closing. She was 47 minutes early, as always. She took her seat at the human table, which was positioned near the back of the chamber's inner ring. Other delegations sat closer to the central floor. The Vethari sat closest of all, their tall, segmented forms draped in the dark formal wraps that indicated a senior session. The Salvari clustered in their usual group of 4, small and pale-limbed, whispering to each other in the quick, clicking dialect they used when they thought no one else was listening. The Drath occupied their reinforced seating platform to the left, their 6-legged frames arranged with the kind of perfect stillness that always made Nina feel, faintly, that she was being watched. She opened her notes. She read them. She already knew what they said. The session agenda had been circulated 3 days ago. It was a standard policy review, trade corridor access in the outer reach, environmental standards for terraforming licenses, an ongoing dispute between the Velhari and the Pune over a shared relay network. Human affairs were listed as item 14. There were 16 items on the agenda. Nina poured herself a small glass of water from the carafe on the table. She drank it slowly. She watched the chamber fill. The Vethari delegate arrived last, as was their custom. His name was Vorithsel, and he was the 4th Vethari delegate Nina had dealt with in her 11 years at this post. They all moved the same way, with a kind of slow deliberateness that was less about dignity than about the biological fact that Vethari skeletal structure simply did not allow for hurrying. Vorithsel took his place at the central table and arranged his documentation panels without looking at anyone else in the room. He had never, in 3 years of shared sessions, looked at Nina first. She did not take it personally. She understood what it meant. She had understood for a long time. The session opened on schedule. The Concord's administrative speaker, a Drath official named Kreth, ran through the procedural items in the brisk, toneless manner of someone who had run through procedural items 10,000 times and had no intention of making the 10,001st any different. Trade corridor access consumed 38 minutes. Environmental standards consumed 52. The relay network dispute was tabled for the 3rd consecutive session because the Velhari and the Pune were still not speaking to each other directly, and the Concord had not yet decided whether to make them. Item 14 arrived after 2 hours and 11 minutes. Earth delegation, Kreth said, you have 6 minutes. Nina stood. She had prepared 4 minutes of material. She used all of it, unhurried. She raised a concern about the proposed revision to Deep Space Survey licensing fees, which had been quietly restructured in a way that would cost human science missions approximately 30% more per expedition than missions run by older member species. She presented the figures clearly. She asked for the revision to be reviewed. She sat down with 40 seconds still remaining. Vorithsel did not respond. No one responded. Kreth marked the concern as received and moved to item 15. Nina wrote a small note on her pad. It said, received. She had written the same word, in the same place, after the same kind of moment, more times than she could count. It was not a note for reference. It was a way of keeping herself from saying something she would regret. She had a great deal of practice at that. After the session ended, she walked back to the human residential sector alone. The corridors were quieter in the late period, most delegations retreating to their own quarters for the meal cycle. She passed a Salvari junior aide who nodded at her with the kind of cautious politeness that junior aides of most species directed toward the representatives of civilizations that were not considered important. She nodded back. She kept walking. Her office was small by Concord standards. The Vethari suites took up an entire wing. The Drath compound had its own internal courtyard. The human sector had 8 rooms, a common area, and a communications bay that was perpetually slightly behind on its software updates. She had requested upgrades twice. Both requests had been marked as received. She closed the door behind her, sat at her desk, and opened the secure channel. The call connected after 9 seconds. The face on the other side of the screen was broad-featured and tired, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular expression of a man who had not slept a full night in longer than he could easily remember. Admiral Darnell Okafor looked, as he always looked, like someone who was carrying something very heavy and had simply decided not to put it down. "How was the session?" he said. It was not a question. "Item 14, she said. 6 minutes. The survey fee concern was received. He nodded once. He had heard versions of this report for years. He knew what received meant. "How much longer?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. She had asked this question before, but not often. She tried not to ask it at all. Asking it felt like admitting that the weight was getting to her, and she had too much professional pride for that. But it was late, and the session had been long, and Vorithsel had not looked at her once in 3 years, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Okafor looked at her steadily. "Not long," he said. "We are very close, Nina." She nodded. She closed the channel. She sat in the quiet of her office for a while before she turned off the lights. 3 days later, the Salvari filed a report. It arrived in the Concord administrative system at the start of the morning cycle and was flagged immediately by 3 separate automated review processes, which was unusual. Automated flags usually meant either a procedural irregularity or a territorial concern, and territorial concerns almost always meant someone had found something where they were not expecting to find it. In this case, a Salvari long-range survey probe, deployed 18 months ago as part of a routine mapping pass through the unmapped region between the Concord's outer boundary markers and the edge of the deep field dead zone, had returned anomalous readings from a location that the Salvari believed, based on an old and somewhat imprecise territorial notation in their system, might fall within the outer edge of their unclaimed buffer zone. The anomalous readings included structured energy signatures consistent with artificial installation, power output in the low to medium industrial range, several communication frequencies, none of them broadcasting in any recognized Concord format. The Salvari report named the installation as potentially belonging to humanity. They based this on a faint registration signal embedded in one of the communication frequencies, a signal that matched, loosely, the format used by human deep space supply relay stations. Nina was reading the report on her personal pad before she had finished her first cup of coffee. She read it twice, carefully, and then she set the pad down on her desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she opened the secure channel. Okafor answered immediately. He had already seen it. "It is a logistics node," he said, before she could speak. "Outer fuel relay. No construction equipment, no active personnel beyond a maintenance crew of 11. It is not one of the yards." "That does not matter," she said. "They found something. The Salvari will report it formally and the Vethari will use it." "I know." "How long, Darnell?" This time there was a different weight to the question. He heard it. He was quiet for 4 seconds, which was a long time for him. "The program is ready," he said. She had waited 11 years on the station for those 3 words. She had waited 15 years in total, counting the 2 years she had spent being briefed and vetted and read into the program before she ever left Earth. She had spent 17 years carrying this, and now the words were here, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite fear and not quite anything she had a clean name for. "All right," she said. Her voice was level. It was always level. "I will manage the council session. Give me 72 hours. You will have what you need," he said. She closed the channel. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. It had gone cold. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was called for the following morning. Nina submitted the request herself, which surprised several of the administrative staff because it was unusual for a minor delegation to call an emergency session over what appeared to be a simple territorial query. Normally, a territorial query of this kind would be handled through standard review channels over several weeks. The fact that Nina had called for immediate convening raised a few eyebrows and generated a small amount of corridor speculation. Kethvorin heard the speculation from his office in the intelligence gallery on the station's 7th tier. He was not a delegate. He was, technically, a senior analytical observer, one of the Vethri Directorate's most experienced intelligence officers, assigned to Karethvel to monitor Concord dynamics and report on the political behaviors of member species. He had held this post for 9 years. He was very good at it. He was good at it because he paid attention to the things other people dismissed. Most intelligence work, in his experience, was not about finding dramatic secrets. It was about noticing when something ordinary did not quite fit the pattern it was supposed to fit. The emergency session request was ordinary. It was also slightly wrong. Nina Caldwell had been at this station for 11 years. In 11 years, she had never once called for emergency convening over anything. She had absorbed scheduling delays, budget revisions, territorial encroachments on human colony access lanes, and a blockade of 3 human systems that had lasted 14 months, and in all of that, she had worked through standard channels. Patiently, quietly, without escalating. Now a Salvari probe had found a fuel relay in disputed space, and she was calling an emergency session. Kethvorin sat at his desk for a long time after he heard about the request. Then he pulled up 11 years of behavioral logs on Ambassador Caldwell and began reading from the beginning. The emergency session convened at the 2nd morning hour. Every delegation was present. Several had arrived early, which was also unusual. Emergency sessions over territorial queries did not typically generate strong attendance. But there was something in the corridor talk, some particular quality to the way people were moving around the station, that made even the habitually disengaged delegations decide they wanted to be in the room. Nina arrived on time. Not early, not late. She sat at the human table with her 2 aides, a young man named Carl Briggs who had been with her for 2 years and was still at the stage of his career where he found everything surprising, and a senior political analyst named Grace Odom who had been with her for 6 years and had long since learned not to show what she was thinking. Nina had chosen Grace specifically because she was very good at that. Vorthsel arrived. He took his seat. He did not look at Nina. Kreth opened the session and gave the floor to the Salvari, who presented their probe data with careful precision. The readings were clear. The installation existed. It was in a zone of ambiguous territorial status. It appeared to be of human origin. The Salvari, who were by nature more anxious about procedural correctness than about political outcomes, asked simply that the matter be reviewed and clarified. Vorthsel spoke next, before Nina was offered the floor. He did not ask to speak. He simply spoke, and Kreth, who was not going to argue with the Vethri senior delegate about procedure in an open session, let it pass. Vorthsel said the installation represented a clear violation of the Concord's deep space exclusion protocols. He said that unauthorized installations in unmapped buffer zones were a matter of Concord security, not just territorial administration. He said that a formal inspection fleet should be authorized immediately, and that in the meantime human deep space survey licensing should be suspended pending a full review of Earth's compliance with Concord operational boundaries. Several delegates signaled agreement. The draft representative added a recommendation that human communications in the outer reach be placed under monitoring protocols. The Velhari, who rarely spoke on matters not directly involving their own interests, offered a statement supporting the call for inspection. Nina listened to all of it. She had a stylus in her hand. She turned it slowly, end over end, without looking at it. It was a habit she had when she was thinking, though to people who did not know her it sometimes looked like impatience. Grace sat beside her and kept her face neutral. Carl wrote notes that he did not share with anyone. When the speaking wound down, Kreth turned to the human table. "Ambassador Caldwell, you have the floor." She stood. She set the stylus down carefully on the table. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was clear and easy, the voice of someone who had no particular anxiety about what she was about to say. "I want to first acknowledge the Salvari concern as completely legitimate. Their probe found something. They reported it. That is exactly how this system is supposed to work, and I respect it." She paused. The chamber was quiet. "I also want to acknowledge the concerns raised by Delegate Vorthsel. The existence of an undisclosed human installation in a buffer zone does raise questions that deserve answers. She looked briefly, directly at Vorithsel. I intend to provide those answers. All of them. Something in the way she said all of them made Kethvorin, watching from the gallery above, go very still. I am requesting 72 hours, she continued. At the end of that period, I will arrange a full and transparent demonstration of Earth's deep space activities. I ask only that the inspection authorization and the licensing suspension be held in abeyance until that demonstration has been completed. After that, the Concord can proceed however it sees fit. Vorithsel said, a demonstration of what, precisely? Nina looked at him. Of what humanity has been doing, she said. In deep space. For the last 60 years. The chamber was not silent in the way it was silent when nothing was happening. It was silent in the way it was silent when a large number of very experienced political minds were simultaneously trying to figure out what they had just heard and what it meant and whether they should be worried about it. Vorithsel's chromatophores did not change color. He was too controlled for that. But something around his secondary eyes shifted slightly, and Kethvorin, who had spent years learning to read Vetheri micro-expression, recognized it. It was reassessment. Very fast, very small, but it was there. 72 hours, Kreth said. The request is noted. The authorization and suspension motions will be held pending the demonstration. Nina sat down. She picked up her stylus. She turned it again, slowly, end over end. Carl leaned slightly toward her and said, very quietly, Ambassador, what demonstration? She did not answer him. Not because she was being unkind, but because some things were still not ready to be said out loud. Kethvorin left the session before it formally closed. He walked quickly back to his office, which was unusual for him. He was habitually deliberate in his movements, unhurried, never appearing rushed in public corridors because appearing rushed was the kind of thing that suggested you had information you were reacting to, and a good intelligence officer never suggested that. Today he did not care. He sat down at his workstation and pulled up everything he had on Nina Caldwell. Not just the 11 years of session logs, but the full record, her career history on Earth, her appointment process, her academic background, the internal communications of the human delegation that the Directorate had managed to partially intercept over the years. He had read most of this before. He had built a comprehensive behavioral model of her over 9 years of observation. He knew how she argued, how she retreated, when she pushed and when she absorbed. He knew her patterns. He started reading again, but this time he read differently. He read looking for the thing he had not been looking for before. He was looking for the shape of a strategy. It took him 4 hours. He skipped his meal cycle. His aide came to the door twice and he waved her away both times without looking up. What he found, when he finally saw it clearly, was not one thing. It was a pattern that ran through 11 years of sessions and stretched further back, into the records of the previous 2 human ambassadors. A consistent, deliberate pattern of absorbing more than was necessary. Of accepting terms slightly worse than the humans could have negotiated for, in situations where they had at least some leverage. Of choosing again and again not to push back in moments where pushing back would have been both reasonable and effective. He had attributed this, over the years, to human political disorganization. The species had hundreds of national governments, dozens of competing policy blocks, and a well-documented tendency toward internal disagreement that often made it hard for their diplomatic representatives to take strong unified positions. He had assumed the pattern was weakness, the result of a civilization that could not get out of its own way. But now he looked at the pattern from a different angle, and it did not look like weakness at all. It looked like deliberate restraint. It looked like a civilization that had made a calculated decision at some point to keep its head down, to let the Concord's dominant powers believe exactly what they wanted to believe, to absorb the indignities, accept the poor terms, take the 6-minute floor allocations and the back row seating and the survey fee revisions and the 14-month blockades, and to do it all without protest, not because they had no power to protest, but because they were saving that power for something else. Kethvorin sat back in his chair. He looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he wrote an urgent intelligence brief, marked it for immediate delivery to the Vetheri High Command, and transmitted it. He did not know, when he sent it, that the High Command's processing queue for non-emergency analytical briefs ran a standard 48-hour review delay. He did not know that by the time his brief reached anyone with the authority to act on it, the 72 hours would already be over. He found out later. He thought about it for a long time after that. He was not sure it would have mattered even if the timing had been different. But he thought about it anyway. Aboard a ship that did not appear in any Concorde registry, in a region of space that no Concorde survey vessel had ever passed through, Captain Lena Hurst stood at the bridge viewport and looked at nothing. There was nothing to look at, technically. The dead zone between the brown dwarf cluster and the outer marker boundary was exactly what its name suggested, a long, lightless stretch of space with no notable features, no habitable bodies, no reason for any passing ship to slow down or change course. The stars from here were dimmer than they looked from Earth. The background radiation was slightly elevated. The navigation systems ran their recalibration cycles twice as often as normal because of the irregular gravitational field. It was, in every meaningful sense, the middle of nowhere. Which was why, 62 years ago, a small group of very serious people had chosen it as one of 17 primary construction sites. The Mariana was 11 kilometers long. This was a fact that Lena had known intellectually since she was recruited into the Longshore program 16 years ago, and that she had understood emotionally for approximately the first time about 3 months after she had walked the ship's lower decks from bow to stern, a journey that had taken her most of a day. She was not a person who was easily awed. She had grown up on Europa, which had its own particular brand of stark grandeur, and she had spent 20 years in naval service before Longshore, which had a way of normalizing the extraordinary. But the Mariana had gotten to her. She had not been able to explain it to anyone at the time, mostly because there was no one she was allowed to explain it to, but the feeling had stayed. It was not the size, exactly. It was what the size meant. Someone had decided to build this. Someone had looked at the situation humanity was in, junior member, back row seating, 6 minutes, received, and had decided that the answer was not to lobby harder or protest louder or appeal to the Concorde's stated values. The answer was to build something that made all of that irrelevant, and then to keep it secret for 6 decades while everyone who needed to believe humans were small went right on believing it. She found that more overwhelming than the ship itself, sometimes. Her first officer, a quiet man named Cal Dryden, came to stand beside her at the viewport. He had been with her since the Mariana's first internal inspection tour, 8 years ago. He was not a demonstrative person. He communicated mostly in short sentences and meaningful pauses, which suited her. "Communication from Admiral Okafor," he said. She turned from the viewport. "And? We are go for transition. 72-hour clock starts at 0600. She nodded. She had known this was coming. She had been waiting for it. But hearing it stated as an operational fact made something in her stomach tighten. "Inform the fleet," she said. "Standard formation. I want all systems checked twice before we move." "Already ordered," Kel said. She looked at him. He almost smiled. "You knew," she said. "I assumed," he said. "After the ambassador's session this morning, it seemed likely." She turned back to the viewport. Outside, in the darkness that the station's exterior lights barely touched, the shapes of other ships were faintly visible if you knew where to look, great dark masses against the slightly less dark background of space, holding their positions with the patience of things that had been waiting a very long time. "How do you feel about it?" Cal asked. He did not ask this kind of question often. Lena considered the question seriously, which she always did when it deserved it. "I am not sure yet," she said. "Ask me again in 73 hours. He nodded. He went back to his station. She stayed at the viewport for a while longer. She had been 8 years old when her father left for the Longshore Initiative. He had told her he was going to help build the future. She had asked him what the future would look like. He had said he did not know exactly, but that it would be different from the present. She had spent the next 36 years figuring out what he meant. She thought she understood it now. She was not entirely sure that understanding made it easier. Back on Carithvel, the next 72 hours moved differently than hours usually moved. Normally, a station like this operated in a rhythm: sessions in the morning cycle, diplomatic working groups in the afternoon, social functions in the evening, the whole thing repeating with the comfortable predictability of a place where nothing very urgent was ever happening. It was one of the things Nina had always found mildly unbearable about the station, and one of the things she had trained herself to endure. Now the rhythm was broken. She could feel it. The corridor conversations were different. Delegations that normally had no reason to cross paths were finding reasons. Intelligence aides were moving faster than usual. The Salvari had called 3 internal meetings since the session. Vorthsel had not been seen outside the Vetheri compound at all, which meant he was either sleeping, which was unlikely, or communicating with the directorate, which was certain. Nina let it all move around her. She spent the 72 hours doing what she always did, working. She drafted responses to the survey fee concern that had been raised and received at item 14. She reviewed the upcoming agenda for the next standard session. She wrote 3 careful, thorough reports for the United Earth Government's Foreign Affairs Office. She slept 6 hours each of the first 2 nights, which was 2 hours more than she usually managed. On the morning of the 3rd day, 2 hours before the demonstration window, she received a personal comm request from Kethvorin. She accepted it. She was mildly surprised that he had reached out, but she had learned over the years that being surprised by things was only useful if you let it make you more attentive, not more reactive. His face appeared on the screen. He looked like someone who had also not slept much, but unlike Okafor, Kethvorin did not carry sleeplessness the way a sailor carries weight, distributed and absorbed. He carried it like a person who was used to certainty and was finding its absence uncomfortable. "Ambassador," he said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "I have been reviewing my behavioral analysis of your delegation. Of multiple human delegations, going back some years." He paused. "I believe I have been making an error in interpretation." She watched him. She did not offer anything. "The pattern I attributed to political disorganization," he said. "I no longer think that is the correct reading." "What do you think the correct reading is?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I think you were waiting for something," he said. "I think you have all been waiting for something. For a long time." Nina was quiet for a moment. Outside her office window, the station turned slowly against the stars, the same way it had been turning for 11 years. "You are a very good analyst, Kethvorin," she said. "You always have been. I have a great deal of respect for the way you work." He waited. "What you are about to see today," she said, "is not a threat. I want you to know that, coming from me directly before it happens. It is not a weapon being pointed. It is a condition being stated. There is a difference." He was quiet for several seconds. "How large a condition?" he said. She almost smiled. It was not an unkind expression. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and was just now, for the first time, setting a small part of it down. "Large," she said, "but manageable, I think. If everyone is willing to be reasonable." She closed the channel. At the demonstration hour, Nina requested that all Concord delegates assemble at the main observation deck of Kareth Vel. She sent the request through the formal administrative channel, which meant it went to Kreth, who was professionally obligated to convey it. She did not explain the reason. The request simply said that the demonstration she had promised at the emergency session would take place at the indicated time, and that all delegates were invited to observe. She did not say invited. She said, in the careful diplomatic language she had spent a career perfecting, their attendance was respectfully encouraged. In Concord diplomatic language, that phrase meant, be there. Delegates arrived at the observation deck with the particular mix of reluctance and curiosity that characterized most Concord assemblies when no one was entirely sure what was about to happen. The Salvari came in a group of 6, unusually large for an informal assembly. The Drath arrived in pairs, their leg joints clicking softly on the observation deck flooring. Even several of the typically disengaged minor delegations showed up. The Pune sent 3 representatives. The quiet mammalian species called the Reth sent 2. Vorthsel arrived and took a position near the front viewport. He stood with his secondary arms folded and said nothing to anyone. Kethvorin was in the gallery above the deck, watching through a transparent partition. He had a sensor readout running on his pad. Nina arrived last. She walked to the viewport and stood with her hands clasped behind her back. Carl stood 2 steps behind her. Grace stood beside him, her face its usual careful neutral. The observation deck looked out over the forward quadrant of the station's approach corridor, the main traffic lane that survey and diplomatic vessels used when arriving at or departing from Carithvel. It was usually empty at this hour. There was no scheduled traffic. The station's long-range sensors registered the anomaly at 6 minutes past the demonstration hour. A single blip at the edge of the sensor range. Then a second. Then 4 more, appearing almost simultaneously. Then 17. One of the Salvari delegates made a small, sharp sound. The first ship to enter visual range came in slowly, with every sensor profile running wide open, not because it needed to, but because it was important, in this moment, that there be absolutely no ambiguity about what it was. It was gray-hulled and enormous, and it moved the way very large things moved in space, with a kind of unhurried certainty that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with mass. It settled into a position 40,000 kilometers off the station's bow and held there, steady and immovable as a fact. Then the second ship appeared. Then the third. They came in steady sequence, each one taking its position in the growing formation arc with the precision of something that had been rehearsed for a very long time. By the 6th ship, the observation deck was completely silent. By the 10th, 2 of the Salvari representatives had sat down on the floor because their legs had stopped working correctly. By the 14th, Vorithsel had not moved, had not spoken, and had lost most of the color in his facial chromatophores. He stood at the viewport with the stillness of someone who was performing composure rather than feeling it. Nina watched the fleet appear without expression. She watched the 14th ship settle into formation and hold. She watched the Concord delegates around her process what they were seeing, the way the silence changed quality as the reality of it sank in. She had been carrying this for 17 years. She had sat in this station for 11 years absorbing 6-minute floor allocations and survey fee revisions and the quiet, constant weight of being considered small. She had said received and written it on her pad and kept her face level and her voice clear and her patience intact, year after year, because she had known, in some part of herself that she could never speak out loud, that it was finite. It was finite. She turned from the viewport to face the room. Humanity built these ships, she said. Her voice was clear and level, the same voice she had used for 11 years of 6-minute floor allocations. We began construction 62 years ago. The program employed 4 million people over the course of its existence. Not one of them ever told anyone outside the program what they were building. Not one. She paused for a moment, not for effect, but because she genuinely needed the pause. We built them because the Concorde's protections were never applied to us the way they were applied to older members. We built them because we were blockaded and no one intervened. We built them because we were given 6 minutes and seated in the back and told, in 100 different quiet ways, that we did not matter enough to be worth the Concorde's full consideration. She looked at Vorithsel. He looked back at her. It was the first time in 3 years. We do not want to use these ships, she said. We want to talk. We want a new agreement. Equal protections, equal standing, equal time. That is all we want. These ships are not a declaration of war. They are a demonstration that we are serious about the conversation. She let that sit for a moment. The fleet you are looking at, she said, is not the entire fleet. Vorithsel spoke. His voice was controlled, but something in it was not quite right. A slight flatness, the sound of a person managing very carefully. How many ships? He said. Nina held his gaze. I would rather show you, she said. She nodded once to Grace, who pressed 2 keys on the pad in her hand. On the station's main sensor array, every display simultaneously went white. The Mariana did not approach from the standard corridor. She came from the port side, dropping out of transit approximately 600 kilometers off the station's beam, and she did not slow down immediately. She came in at transit speed for approximately 4 seconds before her deceleration drives engaged, which meant that for 4 seconds, the observation deck viewport filled with a moving wall of dark gray hull plating that had no visible end in any direction. When she finally stopped, she was close enough that the station's exterior lights were reflecting off her forward sections in long curved lines. The viewport showed her bow section, and only her bow section, because the rest of her simply went on beyond the visible angle. From 600 kilometers, she looked like a structure. She looked like something that had been there for a long time and intended to remain. The observation deck was absolutely still. Somewhere behind Nina, a data pad hit the floor. No one reached to pick it up. Vorthsel stood at the viewport. He was looking at the Mariana. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that has changed, in a single moment, the fundamental shape of the world they had believed they were living in. Nina stood beside him, though not close. She looked at her ship. She had seen the Mariana many times. She had toured her, studied her schematics, received briefings on her systems and capabilities. But she had never seen her from the outside, at distance, from a station viewport, surrounded by people who were experiencing her for the first time. That was different. That was something she had not been prepared for. She felt, suddenly and without warning, like crying. Not from sadness. From the specific exhaustion of having waited for something for a very long time and finally watching it arrive. She did not cry. She was in the middle of a diplomatic demonstration with 17 alien species watching her, and she was a professional, and she had been a professional for a long time. But she felt it. She let herself feel it, for exactly as long as she was standing there. Then she turned back to the room. There was work to do. There was always more work to do. The Mariana did not move. That was the thing that stayed with everyone afterward. Not the size of her, though the size was something that rewired the brain whether you wanted it to or not. It was the stillness. 600 kilometers off the station's port side, holding position with an effortless, absolute steadiness, she simply existed. She did not need to do anything else. She did not broadcast warnings or run active targeting systems or perform any of the gestures that warships typically made when they wanted to communicate power. She was large enough that her presence alone said everything that needed to be said. The observation deck took a long time to empty. Delegates stood at the viewport in small groups, not quite talking, not quite leaving. A few of the junior aides had their translation devices running on open capture, recording the sensor feeds automatically, doing what junior aides did when they did not know what else to do. 2 of the Salvari representatives were still sitting on the floor. Nobody seemed to think this was strange under the circumstances. Vorthsel left without a word. He walked to the exit with the controlled, deliberate pace of a person who was very aware of being watched and was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him hurry. His chromatophores were still pale. He had not recovered his color by the time he reached the corridor, and the corridor was empty enough that it did not matter. Nina stayed until the last delegates had gone. She stood at the viewport and looked at the Mariana in the middle distance. Carl had stopped trying to get her attention approximately 40 minutes ago and had retreated to a seat near the back of the deck, waiting. Grace stood beside her quietly, which was what Grace did when there was nothing useful to say. After a while, Nina said, "Get me a meeting with Kethvorin. Tomorrow morning. His office or mine, his choice." Grace made a note. "Anything else tonight?" "No," Nina said. "Tonight I am just going to stand here for a few more minutes." Grace nodded and moved away to give her the space. Nina looked at the ship. She had known the Mariana's dimensions for 15 years. She had studied schematics, reviewed capability briefings, read every engineering report that the program's communications team had transmitted to Earth's Foreign Affairs Office. She had carried the knowledge of the Mariana the way you carry a key to a door you are not yet allowed to open, aware of its weight, careful with it, never forgetting it was there. Now the door was open, and the thing on the other side was larger than even she, who knew exactly what to expect, had been fully prepared for. She allowed herself 5 more minutes. Then she went back to work. Kethvorin chose his own office. Nina arrived on time. His office was larger than hers, which was to be expected. Vethri intelligence staff were allocated space the way everything was allocated to Vethri at the Concord, with a generosity that had never been questioned because no one had ever been in a position to question it. The room had a wide viewport, 2 working stations, and walls lined with data archives that Kethvorin clearly actually used, based on the way they were organized, not by category, but by some personal logic that made sense only to him. He was already seated when she entered. He stood briefly in the Vethry acknowledgement gesture, then sat again. He had 2 cups of something warm on the table. He pushed one toward her without explanation. She accepted it without making it a moment. "You did not sleep," she said. "Neither did you," he said. She conceded the point with a slight tilt of her head. He looked at her across the table. He had the expression of someone who had prepared several opening statements and discarded all of them on the walk to the door. "I sent an urgent brief to High Command," he said, 31 hours before the demonstration. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You knew I had figured it out." "I suspected you might," she said. "You are very good at your work. I have said so before." "My brief did not arrive in time to matter." "No." He looked at the table. Something moved across his face, not quite frustration, not quite admiration. Something between them that did not have a clean name in either of their languages. "How long have you known about the fleet specifically?" he said. "Not the program. The fleet. The readiness." 15 years, she said. "I was read into the program 2 years before I was posted here." He absorbed this. "And you sat through 11 years of sessions?" he said. 6 minutes. Back row seating. Survey fee revisions. "Yes." "Did you enjoy it?" he said. "I asked you this before on the comm. You did not fully answer." She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. She looked at it for a moment, not evasively, but the way someone looks at a thing when they are trying to be precise about something that is not easy to be precise about. "No," she said. "I did not enjoy it. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of this story, the version some of your colleagues are probably already telling each other, where humanity was laughing quietly at the Concorde for 60 years. Where we found the condescension amusing. Where the 6-minute floor allocations were just a performance, and none of it ever really landed." She looked up at him. "That is not what happened. Every blockade was a real blockade. Every survey fee revision was real money that human science missions did not have. Every 6 minutes was 6 minutes of being told, in the most polite possible way, that our concerns did not warrant the Concorde's full attention. It hurt every time. The only thing that made it bearable was knowing it was finite." Kethvorin was quiet for a long moment. Outside his viewport, the station turned, and the Mariana was briefly visible before the angle shifted and she was gone again. "What made it finite?" he said. "You could have revealed the fleet earlier. 5 years ago. 10 years ago. We needed the Concorde to have enough memory of who we were," she said. "Enough accumulated history of humanity as the small, patient, never quite important enough species. We needed that to be the established truth, deeply enough believed, that when it changed it would change everything. If we had revealed the fleet 10 years ago, before the pattern was complete, it might have been explained away. A lucky construction program. A temporary capability. Something to be waited out and managed." She shook her head slightly. "We needed 60 years of being what we were so that the moment of being something else would be impossible to misread." Kethvorin sat back in his chair. He had been an intelligence analyst for 30 years. He had read strategies, mapped intentions, built behavioral models of every major species in the Concorde. He was, within his field, one of the best there was. He was looking at a woman who had spent 11 years executing a piece of strategic patience so precise and so sustained that he, watching her every day for 9 of those years, had not seen it for what it was until 31 hours before it concluded. "What do you want from this?" he said. "Not the official position. You personally. What do you want?" She looked at him directly. "I want a Concorde that works the way it claims to work," she said. "Equal protection. Equal standing. No species left to absorb blockades because everyone has decided they are too small to bother defending. No 6-minute floor allocations. No survey fee structures that are quietly designed to limit the expansion of civilizations the older members find inconvenient." She set the cup down. "That is what I want. It is not a complicated thing. It should not have required what it required to ask for it." He nodded slowly. "And if the Concorde refuses to reform?" She glanced toward the viewport. The angle had shifted again and the Mariana's bow section was visible once more, dark and enormous in the middle distance. "The Concorde will not refuse," she said. He looked at the ship. Then he looked back at her. "No," he said quietly. "I do not think it will." He picked up his own cup. He drank from it. He looked thoughtful in a way that had nothing to do with tactics anymore. "For what it is worth," he said, "I am sorry. For the 6 minutes. For the blockades. For all of it that I observed and analyzed and never once questioned whether it was right." Nina looked at him for a moment. She had not expected that. She was not certain she had a prepared answer for it. "I know," she said finally. "I believe you." She picked up the cup again. "That is worth something." Aboard the Mariana, Lena Hurst had not slept either. She had tried, during the 3rd hour after the fleet's arrival at the station, to lie down in her quarters for a standard rest cycle. She had stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes, listening to the faint, constant sound of the ship around her, the ventilation cycling, the structural micro-adjustments the hull made in response to the gravitational influences of the station's mass, the distant, barely audible hum of the drive systems in standby mode. She knew all of these sounds. She had been listening to them for 8 years. They were as familiar as breathing. She got up after 40 minutes and went back to the bridge. Cal was there, which she had expected. He kept bridge hours that overlapped significantly with hers, not because his duty rotation required it, but because he was the kind of person who was more comfortable doing something than not doing something, and the bridge was where the doing happened. He looked at her when she came in. He did not say anything about the fact that she had clearly not slept. She appreciated that about him. She took her position at the main viewport and looked at the station. At this distance it was a detailed shape. She could see the wing structures and the docking rings and the observation deck where, 12 hours earlier, 17 alien species had watched her ship appear and gone very quiet. "Any communications from the Admiral?" she asked. "Standard hold," Cal said. "We maintain position, all systems nominal, await further orders." "And the rest of the fleet?" "Holding formation. No incidents." She nodded. She looked at the station. She thought about the people inside it. Nina, managing what she could only imagine was an extraordinary amount of diplomatic pressure right now. The Vetheri, recalculating. The Salvari, probably in their 7th meeting of the day. The dozens of aides and analysts and junior officials who had come to this station for a routine year of Concorde administration and had found themselves instead in the middle of something that would be written about for the next 3 centuries. "Cal," she said. "Captain. When you first came aboard," she said, "when you first walked the ship, what did you think?" He was quiet for a moment, which with him usually meant he was giving the question its proper respect. "I thought it was the loneliest thing I had ever seen," he said. She turned to look at him. "A ship this size," he said, "built where no one would ever find it, for a purpose no one was ever supposed to know about. Just existing in the dark. Waiting." He looked at the station through the viewport. "I thought it was the loneliest thing. And also, I thought it was exactly right. That it could only have been built in secret, in the dark, by people who were willing to be lonely for a long time." Lena looked at the ship's console for a moment. At the displays showing the Mariana's status, all systems green, all sections holding everything where it was supposed to be. 11 kilometers of hull and engines and weapons systems and crew quarters and science bays and medical decks and storage holds, all of it functioning, all of it real. "My father never saw her finished," she said. It was the first time she had said this out loud to anyone on the ship. She was not entirely sure why she was saying it now. He died 4 years before the program was declared complete. He spent 30 years of his life on the construction teams and never saw what they built. Cal said nothing. He understood that nothing was the right answer. "He told me once," she said, "that the hardest part was not the secrecy. He said everyone assumed the secrecy was the hard part, not being able to tell your family what you were doing, not being able to talk about it, carrying it everywhere. But he said that was just a discipline. You learned it and you practiced it and it became a habit." She paused. "He said the hardest part was not knowing if it would matter. Not knowing if you would finish in time. Not knowing whether, when it was finally done, it would be enough." The station turned against the stars. The Mariana held her position. Was it enough? Cal asked. Lena looked at the Concorde station. She thought about Nina standing at that viewport 12 hours ago. She thought about the silence that had fallen over the observation deck when the 14th ship appeared. She thought about the moment the Mariana dropped out of transit and the light from the station reflected off her hull. I think so, she said. I think it was exactly enough. The first formal response from the Vethery Directorate arrived at Carithville 22 hours after the demonstration. It was not delivered through the standard Concorde administrative channel. It was delivered by a personal envoy, a senior military official whose translated name was Vetheramal, and who arrived on a fast courier ship that the station's docking authority had to scramble to accommodate because nobody had expected a vessel of that classification to show up without advance notice. Vetheramal was old, by Vethery standards, and he moved like it, carefully, with the precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that the body's tolerances were finite and should not be wasted on anything unnecessary. He was the highest-ranking Vethery military official to set foot on a Concorde diplomatic station in 40 years. His arrival alone said more than his words would. Nina met him in the main conference room. She brought Grace and one other aide, a methodical young woman named Petra Voss who had the particular gift of being able to take thorough notes without ever appearing to be paying attention. Admiral Okafor attended via secure link, a small display screen at Nina's end of the table, positioned so that Vetheramal could see it clearly. She had not asked the Admiral to join. He had simply been there when she opened the channel, which told her everything she needed to know about how closely he was watching this process. Vetheramal sat across the table. He looked at Nina with the direct, flat attention of a person who had spent 50 years learning to see situations without the softening influence of personal feeling. He looked at the display screen where Okafor waited. He looked at Petra, who was pretending to read something on her pad. He looked back at Nina. The Directorate has authorized me to speak plainly, he said. Please, Nina said. The Vethery Directorate acknowledges, he said, with the careful, weighted slowness of someone who had rehearsed a statement that they wanted to say correctly, that its historical conduct within the Concorde framework was not always consistent with the Concorde's foundational principles of equal standing and mutual protection. He paused. The Directorate is prepared to support a full and comprehensive review of Concorde membership equity protocols, with the aim of establishing binding standards that apply equally to all member species. He stopped. He waited. Nina looked at him. She had waited 17 years for something very much like this moment. She had imagined various versions of it over the years, sometimes adversarial, sometimes grudging, sometimes too little. This was not too little. It was not an apology, because Vethery did not apologize, and she had known that going in, and she had prepared herself not to need one. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a statement of willingness to change, delivered by the right person, with enough authority behind it to be binding. She did not let the moment become a performance. She accepted the statement with a simple acknowledgement, moved directly to the first item on her prepared agenda for the meeting, and began the work. Okafor watched from the screen. He said nothing during the entire meeting. He did not need to. The Concorde convened a plenary session 4 days later. It was not, technically, an emergency session, because the bureaucratic designation of emergency required certain procedural conditions that had not all been met. It was listed in the administrative calendar as an extraordinary general review, which was a category that had existed in the Concorde's founding charter and had been used exactly twice in the organization's history, both times for matters of fundamental structural significance. Nina prepared for the session the way she had prepared for every session in 11 years, early, thorough, without drama. She reviewed every delegate's known position. She mapped the probable voting alignments. She prepared for 7 different versions of how the discussion might go, including 2 versions where it went badly, because she was a professional and professionals did not assume that things would go well simply because they had leverage. On the morning of the session, before she left for the chamber, Carl knocked on her office door. She told him to come in. He stood in the doorway with the slightly uncertain expression he still got sometimes when he was not sure whether a moment called for professional distance or human directness. He had been working on that uncertainty for 2 years. She found it one of his better qualities. "Ambassador," he said, "I just wanted to say, I have been with you for 2 years, and I did not know about any of this until the demonstration. And I understand why I did not know. I am not troubled by that." He paused. "I just wanted to say that watching you in that session, after the ships appeared, you were the calmest person in the room. By a significant distance." She looked at him. "I had more practice than anyone else in there," she said. He nodded, not quite sure if that was a joke or not. It was both. She let him carry that ambiguity with him and went to the session. The chamber was full in a way it was rarely full. Every delegation had sent its maximum permitted representation. The minor species that usually sent 1 or 2 observers had sent full delegations. 3 civilizations that had never once sent a delegate to a Concord plenary in living memory had submitted emergency observer requests overnight, and Kreth, who had spent 30 years as administrative speaker and prided himself on running a procedurally correct chamber, had approved them all, which told Nina something about the quality of the moment. She sat at the human table. For the first time in 11 years, the human table had been repositioned. It was still in the inner ring, not at the center, that would come later, through the proper process, but it was no longer at the back. Kreth had made the adjustment quietly, without announcement, which she thought was the right way to do it. Vorithsel was present. He sat at the Vethry table and looked at the center of the chamber rather than at anyone in particular. His chromatophores were back to their normal deep color. He had recovered himself, which she had expected. Vethry were not fragile. They were just, occasionally, surprised. Kethvorin was in the gallery. He had his analysis pad. He was not running behavioral models today. He was simply watching. Kreth opened the session. The chamber settled into silence. He read the purpose of the session into the record, a vote on the proposed Longshore Accord, which had been drafted over the preceding 4 days in working groups that Nina had attended for a combined total of 31 hours. The accord established new foundational standards for Concord membership, equal floor time for all delegations, equal application of the Mutual Protection Clause, equal standing in trade and licensing negotiations, an independent review board to assess historical inequities and recommend remediation. It was not a perfect document. No document drafted in 4 days by representatives of 17 species ever was. But it was a real document, with enforceable provisions and a clear implementation timeline. The debate lasted 3 hours. Several delegations offered amendments, some substantive, some procedural. Nina responded to each one with the same unhurried clarity she brought to everything. She accepted 2 amendments that improved the document. She declined 3 that weakened it, with explanations detailed enough that the delegations offering them could not reasonably push back without appearing to argue against their own stated interests. Vorithsel spoke once, near the end of the debate. He did not advocate for or against the accord. He said, in the careful, weighted language of official Vethry statement, that the Directorate supported the review process and would participate constructively in implementation. That was all. It was enough. When the most powerful military species in the Concord announced it would participate constructively, the remaining undecided delegations found their positions clarifying fairly quickly. Kreth called the vote. Nina sat with her hands flat on the table. She did not turn her stylus. She waited. The result came in sequence, delegation by delegation, as the Concord's voting protocol required. The Salvari voted in favor. The Drath voted in favor. The Velhari voted in favor, which surprised the chamber, because the Velhari had not supported a structural reform motion in decades. The Pune voted in favor. The Reth voted in favor. 6 of the 7 minor delegations voted in favor. The 7th abstained. The Vethry voted in favor. The final count was 16 in favor, 1 abstention, 0 against. Kreth read the result into the record. The chamber was very quiet for a moment. Not the tense quiet of before the demonstration. A different kind of quiet. The quiet of something settling into place. Nina looked at the vote display. 16 in favor. She had prepared for 7 different scenarios. None of them had included 16 in favor. She had modeled that as the best-case outcome but had given it roughly a 12% probability based on her read of the delegates' historical positions. She had been wrong in the best possible direction. She looked at the display for a moment longer. Then she looked at her hands, flat on the table. Carl, beside her, said very quietly, "Ambassador." She looked at him. His face was doing several things at once. She understood the feeling. "Yes," she said. "Just that." Then she began gathering her documents, because the session would continue with implementation procedure and she needed to be paying attention. On his secure screen, Okafor saw the vote come in. He was alone in his quarters on the command ship when it happened. He had not wanted to watch from the bridge, surrounded by crew. He had wanted to watch it privately, the way you received news that you had been waiting a very long time for. He sat with the result on the screen for a while. He was 61 years old. He had been recruited into the Longshore program at 32. He had given 29 years to it, longer than most marriages, longer than his children had been alive, longer than any other single thing in his life. He had spent those years in places that did not appear on any official map, around ships that did not exist in any official registry, working toward a moment that he was not always certain would come in his lifetime. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at them. He had not expected that. He was not, generally, a man who shook. He was a man who held things steady while everything else moved. That was what he had done for 29 years. He let himself feel it for a moment. Just a moment. Then he picked up his comm and sent a single message to every commanding officer in the Longshore fleet, all 47 of them. The message was 4 words. It said, "The work is done." He sat back. He looked at the ceiling. Somewhere in the next 24 hours there would be announcements and interviews and historical commissions, and all the complicated machinery of a galaxy processing something it had not known was coming. There would be implementation meetings and reform committees and an enormous amount of very detailed bureaucratic work that would take years to complete. There would be questions he would need to answer, many of them uncomfortable, about the nature of the program, its cost, what he had asked of the people who had built it. He was ready for all of that. He had been getting ready for all of that for 29 years. But right now, for this one moment, he just sat in his quarters on a ship that was finally, officially, registered in the Concorde's records, and he let the weight of it rest on him for a little while before he picked it up again. The formal integration of the Longshore fleet into the Concorde's recognized structure took 6 days of procedural work. Every vessel had to be documented, registered, and assigned identification codes in the Concorde's Universal Registry. Their construction histories had to be entered into the record. Their capabilities had to be disclosed at the level required by the new Accord's transparency provisions. Lena Hurst spent those 6 days doing paperwork in a way she had not done paperwork since her basic naval certification exams. The Mariana's registration alone generated 47 distinct documentation packages. She signed most of them personally, which was not strictly required but felt right. This ship had existed in the dark for a very long time. The least Lena could do was put her name on the record that said it was real. On the 6th day, the final registration confirmation came through. It arrived as a standard administrative notification, a code package transmitted from the Concorde registry to the Mariana's communications system, confirmed by automatic receipt, logged in the ship's official record. It was identical in form to the thousands of registration confirmations the Concorde processed every standard cycle. It was entirely ordinary. Lena was on the bridge when it came in. Cal read the confirmation number aloud from the communications console. He did not make it a ceremony. He just read it clearly and accurately, because that was his job. The bridge crew, 9 people at their stations, doing what they did every day, went quiet for a moment when they heard it. Then one of the navigation officers said something quiet to the person next to her. Someone at the tactical station let out a long breath. Someone else laughed, very softly, not at anything in particular, just at the fact of the moment. Lena stood at the viewport. She looked out at the stars, the real stars, not the dimmed-down view from the dead zone construction site, but the full brightness of the space near Carith Vel, with all its traffic and signals and the steady distant presence of the station. "We are in the record," Cal said. She nodded. "The Mariana," he said. Registration confirmed. Official Concord registry. She exists. She always existed, Lena said. The galaxy just caught up. She meant it as a simple statement of fact. It came out sounding like something else, like relief, maybe, or like the particular feeling of putting down something you have been carrying so long that you have forgotten what it felt like to have empty hands. Cal heard both meanings. He let them both stand. He looked at the stars alongside her for a moment. Then, what happens now, Captain? It was not a tactical question. He was not asking about orders or positioning or the fleet's next movement. He was asking the same question the whole crew was carrying. The question that came after the long thing ended and the ordinary thing had not yet started. What did you do when the purpose that had defined you for years had finally been fulfilled? Lena thought about it seriously. She thought about the Longshore Accord and the 16-0 vote and the reform committees that were already meeting and the slow, complicated work of making the Concord into something that functioned the way it claimed to function. She thought about her father, who had spent 30 years on the construction teams and never saw the fleet appear, and what he had said about the hardest part not being the secrecy but the not knowing. She turned from the viewport to face her crew. Now, she said, we find out what this ship can do when it is not a secret. There was a pause. Then the navigation officer smiled. Then the tactical station officer smiled. It moved around the bridge in a quiet wave, not loud, not dramatic, just people who had spent years in the dark taking their first proper look at the light. 9 days after the plenary vote, the Galactic Concord held a formal reception to mark the establishment of the new membership framework. It was the kind of event that the Concord organized well, structured, ceremonial, calibrated to be significant without being excessive. Delegates from all member species attended. The station's main hall was configured for mixed atmospheric accommodation. Somebody had arranged for food from 17 different culinary traditions to be available, which Kreth noted in his opening remarks was the first time in the station's history that had been done. Nina arrived in a deep blue formal jacket that she had brought to the station years ago for exactly this kind of occasion and had never found the right occasion to wear. She stood with Grace and Carl near the main reception area and spoke with delegates she had been working alongside for a decade, many of whom were looking at her with a different quality of attention than they had managed before. Not all of them were comfortable with the adjustment. Some of them were trying quite hard and not fully succeeding. She was patient with the ones who were trying. Vorithsel found her near the end of the reception. He crossed the hall with his characteristic deliberate pace and stopped beside her. He did not offer the standard Vetheri acknowledgement gesture, which would have been appropriate for the occasion. Instead, he simply stood beside her for a moment, looking at the room. The survey fee revision, he said, after a while. She waited. The one that was raised as item 14, he said. Several sessions ago. The one that was received. I remember it, she said. The Directorate will support its reversal, he said. I have already filed the position with the review board. She looked at the room rather than at him. Thank you, she said. He made a short sound that in Vetheri communicative convention indicated acknowledgement of something that should not have needed to be said but did. Then he moved on. Nina stood with her glass and watched the reception. She watched the Salvari delegates talking to the Drath representatives in what appeared to be a relaxed conversation that had not been mediated by anyone. She watched Carl explaining something enthusiastically to a junior Velhari aide who seemed genuinely interested. She watched Kethvorin standing near the viewport with a drink, looking out at the space where the Mariana was still holding position, still perfectly still, still the most extraordinary thing in the visible sky. She thought about the photograph of her parents on the beach in North Carolina. She thought about her father's work in shipping logistics and her mother's history classes and the particular way they had both looked at her when she told them she was going to work in diplomacy. Proud and uncertain at the same time. Proud because she was doing something that mattered. Uncertain because they knew enough history to know that things that matter are rarely easy. They had been right on both counts. Kethvorin glanced over from the viewport and caught her eye. He raised his drink slightly. She raised hers. It was a small thing. It was also exact. She turned back to the room. There were people to speak with and agreements to build and a very large amount of structural work still to be done on the Accord's implementation. There was a reform committee meeting in the morning that she had already prepared 12 pages of notes for. There was a communication she needed to draft for the United Earth government's Foreign Affairs Office that would become, she suspected, something that historians would look at for a long time. There was the ordinary business of a transformed galaxy that was still figuring out what transformation meant on a day-to-day basis. There was so much work left. There always was. She was glad of it. Back on the Mariana, in the quiet hours of the station's night cycle, Lena sat alone in her quarters and wrote a letter. It was a habit she had kept for years, not sending communications, but writing letters in a private file that she never transmitted. It was a way of processing things that she could not talk about with anyone. During the longshore years, the file had filled up slowly with observations and frustrations and small moments of beauty that she had found in the darkness of the dead zone construction sites and the long transit runs between depots. Tonight she wrote to her father. She did it knowing he would never read it, the way she had always known he would never read any of the others. That was not the point. The point was the act of saying it to someone who would have understood it completely. She wrote, "We showed them." Not the way people usually mean when they say that, not vindicatively, not to prove anything to anyone else. We showed them what was there. What was always there. What you spent 30 years helping to build, in the dark, in the cold, in a place where no one would ever find it until we were ready to be found. You never saw it finished. I know. I have thought about that a lot over the years, more than I expected to when I was first told you were gone. I thought I had made my peace with it. I think peace is something you keep making over and over, and it does not stay made. She paused. She looked at the bulkhead. She listened to the sounds of the ship. She wrote, "We are in the record now. All of us. The Mariana is real. The whole fleet is real. It took 62 years and 4 million people who never told anyone and a lot of very cold nights in very empty space, but it is real. The galaxy knows. And now the work starts, the kind of work you can do in the open with your name on it, in a record that anyone can read. You would have liked that, I think. You always said that the hardest part was the not knowing. I understand that now better than I did when you said it. I understand almost everything you said to me better now than I did at the time." She stopped. She read over what she had written. Then she saved the file, closed her pad, and lay down. She fell asleep within minutes. Outside her viewport, the stars turned slowly, the way they always had. The Mariana held her position, steady and enormous and no longer invisible. The station's lights moved across her hull in long reflected lines. The galaxy was awake now to what humanity had done. What it had built. What it had chosen to carry in silence for 62 years, and what it had chosen, finally, to put down. And in the morning, as it always did, the work would continue.